I've been influenced by a novel, by a book written by a man named William Lynch, who was a Jesuit, wrote a book called Images of Hope. It's a very long ago book. But in there he says, hope is an experience of mutuality. We hope with more than we hope for. And I think too often when we think about hope, we have in mind, well, what do you hope for? Well, if you have a very short time ahead, then you hope for a life after death. That becomes the content of hope. And I want to argue that hope is an experience of mutuality. Think about a time in your life when you have been most hopeful. And I want to say it's going to be a time when you were profoundly connected with people and felt some sustaining by that, in that a book written by a German named Norbert Elias on the loneliness of dying some years ago. It's 30 years ago now. Says this: the hardest thing for the dying is the tacit isolation of aging and the dying from the community of the living, the gradual cooling of their relationships to people to whom they were attached, the separation from human beings in general who give them meaning and security. None of which needs to happen, but does. It is not that we are opposed to watching and waiting and do not love the dying we abandon less. Nonetheless, early abandonment of the dying occurs with particular frequency, he says, in more advanced societies. The more advanced the society, the more likely it is that there's going to be a kind of early abandonment. Number 4, faithful witness includes consistent bearing witness to a life. And this is, I think, something we all know. I don't need to belabor this except with a story and then a comment from Becker. My daughter's mother-in-law died in their home of cancer of the liver. And it was about an 18-month period of time. And they live in Connecticut. And hospice volunteer from the Middletown Hospice Unit or Hartford area hospice came to their home and listened to Emma's story and recorded it. And when Emma died, she then presented to the family the story that Emma had told to her about her life. And she had told things to this woman that it would have been hard to tell to her sons. And I've thought so many times, what a wonderful gift, what a wonderful ministry, what a wonderful volunteer activity for people who love stories, to come and listen to the story of a dying person, to bear witness to their life. And so demonstrate more faithful care. In the conversation between Sam Keen and Ernest Becker, there was one really elegant instance of faithful care. Becker is invited to talk about times in his own journey which were ambiguous, and to tell stories about those times. The time in Berkeley, because he was an icon at the University of California, Berkeley before they refused to give him a tenured contract, and he went to Vancouver. By those Berkeley days, he said, it was a great thrill, and they were standing in the classrooms in Berkeley. Several times he says, I have a scrapbook this thick about the Berkeley era, which was undoubtedly the zenith of his career. It's one thing to die knowing the scrapbook exists, but it's quite another to be able to tell someone who listens with interest about those critical moments, or even ordinary moments, or those spectacular moments of a life. And then there's a touching exchange near the end of this interview. Sam Keen promises Becker, I will do a good job for you. So whenever you are with someone who's dying and you've heard their story, you may say to them, I will remember your story. Forever, you won't remember it all. Or you will tell the story in some way. it would be equally important to say at the end of a conversation with a dying person, your story will stay with me for a long time, or I will treasure what I've heard, or I will pass your story on, if you don't mind, to people who will love to hear your story. It's a way of bearing witness. Now the fifth part of faithful care, and this is about advocacy. And let me just say a few things about it, but because it's a little more complicated, I'm indebted to my philosophy son, who teaches philosophy at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. Faithful care advocates for human agency in order to assist the dying to live until they die. In some ways, that's the most important thing I think we can do, that we can help people live until they die. And in order to do that, we need to advocate for their agency. The capacity to act is an essential dimension of being human. Agency is the force in human life that prompts us to choose and to act. Agency transforms nouns into verbs, connection into connect, building into build, health into healing. Gary Gunderson, who is vice president of Bonaire Healthcare in Memphis, says that the single most humane place in the entire modern health system is hospice. It's the single most humane place because it is the one place in the system where we can be sure that everyone is committed to enhancing human agency and well-being. In order to acknowledge dependency and vulnerability among those who are at near death, while at the same time fostering autonomy and agency, caregivers need to be both fearless and faithful in the face of finitude. And you'll get this in the handout in paragraphs. What I learned from my son is he's arguing that autonomy is an intersubjective thing. That is, we don't become autonomous by ourselves. Others acknowledge it in us. What is particularly compelling about this approach is that agency is only if one is taken to have it. That we have agency because other people say we have agency. We have autonomy because other people say this person can hear the full account of their situation in order to make decisions. But we make decisions for people that prematurely limit their autonomy and agency. Whether and how people live until they die is determined by how caregivers regard or recognize them as capable of acting and deciding. It is what philosophers of autonomy call uptake. It is indeed the case that some people are incapable of agency. However, the advocacy dimension of faithful care seeks to secure enough recognition for those near death so that those who are able will be able to live until they die. The promise of palliative care is agency to the end of life. And when Tom Preston comes to talk about that the extension of human agency, how much agency can we have also at the end of life and deciding the end of life. But my point for the moment is how much, if we are living people until we die, then how do we foster this such a central dimension of our living? Our capacity to act, even as it diminishes what we can do. Finally, in order to have, this is the sixth one, faithful care requires caregivers to be willing to accommodate. In order for the dying person to experience the freedom to decide and act in ways that are possible, there will need to be some accommodations among caregivers. Physicians need to take time enough to explain medical options so that the individual can make a responsible choice. Hospice caregivers regularly know the kind of accommodation necessary if an individual is to live fully until they die. Friends and family need to set their own desires or plans aside to make some sacrifice to the needs of the one who wants to live fully until they die. Let me tell one quick story, and then I'm going to read one paragraph and we're done. This happened about 4 years ago. We were having my wife is the president of a theological seminary in Berkeley. We were having a Christmas party for the faculty, and Bob Smith, who had previously non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and had been treated, the lymphoma had come back. And he had decided that he would do no more treatment, no more invasive and aggressive treatment. And so somebody in the course of the party said, Bob, well, what do you want to, it was openly talked about. And he said, well, what do you want to do before you die? And Bob Smith said, I would like to teach my course on the Gospels one more time. That is, books of the Bible. The party broke up, and a recently retired faculty person who also knew the New Testament, and knew New Testament Greek, stayed by and said to my wife, the president, if Bob Smith wants to do that, I'll be his backup. And so Bob Smith taught his course on the Gospels, and Gary Pence sat over on the side every day as a backup. And Bob Smith's wife came with Lysol and cleaned every surface that he would touch so that there would be no danger, minimal danger of contamination. And he taught his last class on a Friday, and he died the following Thursday. That's a dramatic and wonderful story of living until we die. But I think it is very possible in smaller ways, in larger ways, in limited ways to do this. One final thing. Conversation between Sam Keen and Ernest Becker was an interview, but it was also an illustration of faithful care, because it was marked by A, mutual respect between the conversation partners, B, humility about being present to someone who is the expert on dying, the patient, and C, a sense of wonder at the mystery of God and of life. Near the end of the conversation, Sam Keen said that his dream was to be alive all the way to the end of his life. Well, said Becker, if you are really a live person, you are bound to be more and more interested in experience, more and more things to discover, if you are a growing person. And from there, the conversation moved on to another topic before Becker tired and this life moment ended. Becker has it right. The more we are able to embody agency in our dying, the more we need to accept that incompleteness will be a part of our dying as well. Incompleteness at death is unavoidable because there's always something more to do or to discover if one is a living, growing person until he dies. Constant bargaining for more time reveals this deep fear of incompleteness that plagues many people as they die. There's still more to learn and new adventures to experience, and we will never be finished. Sometimes people fear incompleteness more than they fear death. But if we believe that our lives will be judged by finite completeness, it will be easier to live and to love and to learn until we die. That, I humbly submit, is the aim of faithful care of those who are near death. So, thank you very much.